They told me I wasn't getting a dime of my mother's estate. But when the family lawyer stood up at the reception, my sister's face went white. She had no idea what our mother signed. My name is Crystal. I'm 52 years old, and this is the story of the letter my mother hid for 2 decades.
Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I need to take you back to the beginning because you won't understand what happened at that wedding unless you understand what happened at that kitchen table 30 years earlier. I grew up in a small brick house in Ohio with my mother, Vivian, and my younger sister, Rain. Our father left when I was 7, and Rain was 4, and after that, it was just the 3 of us. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. From the inside, it always felt like 2 of us, and 1 of them, Mum and Rain. And me, orbiting the edges, waiting to be let in. I want to be fair here, because I've had a lot of years to think about this, and I don't believe my mother woke up one day and decided to love one daughter more than the other. I think it happened slowly, the way water wears down stone. Rain was a beautiful, easy baby. I was colicky and stubborn, or so I was told 100 times growing up, usually as a joke that didn't quite land as a joke. Rain smiled at strangers. I studied them. Rain wanted to be held. I wanted to be independent, mostly because independence was the only thing nobody could take away from me. By the time I was 10, the pattern was set in concrete. When report cards came home, my A's got a nod. Rain's B's got a trip to the ice cream parlor because Rain struggled more and deserved to be celebrated for trying. When I made the honor roll 3 years running, my mother told the neighbor it ran in the family. When Rain finally made it in her senior year, there was a cake. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for a straight-A kid who didn't get enough cake. I'm telling you because this is the architecture the whole story was built on. In our house, love wasn't a given. It was a performance, and Rain always got the better reviews. The nickname started when I was 12. My Aunt Deb said it first, half joking, at a Thanksgiving dinner. Crystal's always been the steady one, the reliable one. Reliable. That was my role. Rain got to be delicate. Rain got to be the baby, even when she was old enough to drive. I got to be the one who didn't need anything, because apparently I'd proven, somehow, before I even understood what I was proving, that I could go without. So I did. I learned to ask for less. I got a job at 15 bagging groceries so I wouldn't have to ask my mother for spending money, because asking always came with a faint sigh, we'll see, a promise that quietly evaporated. Meanwhile, Rain got a car for her 16th birthday, a hand-me-down from Mum's boyfriend at the time. But still, a car. I took the bus to my job at the grocery store and saved every dollar in a coffee can I hid under my bed, because I'd already learned, somewhere deep in my 12-year-old bones, that nothing in that house was guaranteed to still be there tomorrow, including affection. There's one memory from that stretch I still think about more than almost any other. I was 14, and I'd made the regional spelling bee, the first time anyone from our little junior high had made it that far in nearly a decade. My teacher was thrilled. I was thrilled. I came home with the flyer in my hand, practically vibrating, and found my mother at the kitchen table, helping Rain glue sequins onto a poster board for a school project that was, if I'm honest, not due for another 2 weeks. I stood in the doorway holding my flyer for almost a full minute before my mother even looked up. And when she finally did, she said, "That's nice, honey," and went right back to the sequins. I didn't get to go to the regional bee. There was a scheduling conflict. Rain had a dance recital that same weekend, 3 towns over, and my mother said we simply couldn't be in 2 places at once. I understood, even at 14, exactly which of us was the 2 places, and which of us was the only place that mattered. When I left for college on a partial scholarship, my mother cried at the bus station. I remember being surprised by that, genuinely surprised, because I didn't think I registered that deeply with her. Years later, I'd understand that she wasn't crying because I was leaving. She was crying because for the first time, she'd have to be the only parent in the house, and Rain would have her full, undivided attention, and some small part of my mother, a part I don't think she ever admitted to herself, knew that wasn't entirely fair to me. And the guilt of that unfairness was what put tears in her eyes, not my absence. I worked 2 jobs through college. I graduated with a degree in accounting and a plan. Get a stable job, save aggressively, build a life that didn't depend on anyone's mood swinging in my favor. And for a while, that's exactly what I did. I moved back to Ohio, took a position at a mid-sized firm, and started paying my mother's bills when she couldn't quite cover them. Not because she asked, but because I noticed. And noticing was another thing I'd learned to do well in that house. You survive a childhood like mine by becoming very, very good at reading rooms. Rain, meanwhile, drifted. Not in a tragic way. She wasn't struggling with anything more serious than a series of boyfriends and half-finished associate's degrees, but in a way that always seemed to land softly, because our mother was always there to catch her. When Rain's first marriage fell apart after 18 months, Mum paid for the lawyer. When Rain's car got repossessed in her late 20s, Mum quietly settled the debt and never mentioned it to me. I only found out because I was the one who did our mother's taxes every April, and I saw where the money had gone. I want to be honest with you. I resented it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was a saint who watched all of this happen without feeling anything. I was angry, more often than I let myself admit. Angry in that specific, exhausting way where you also feel guilty for being angry, because you've been told your whole life that you're the strong one, and strong people aren't supposed to need anything, including fairness. But here's the thing nobody tells you about that kind of anger. Eventually, if you're not careful, it curdles into something else. A kind of grim, silent duty. You stop expecting to be chosen, and you start just showing up anyway, because at some point, it becomes less about earning love and more about being the kind of person you can live with. I decided, somewhere in my 30s, that I was going to take care of my mother when she needed it, not because I thought it would finally win me her favor, but because it was the right thing to do, and because some stubborn part of me refused to let Rain's version of the story, the version where Rain was the good daughter, become the only version that got told. I had no idea, back then, just how long taking care of her was going to end up meaning. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer the year I turned 29. Stage 2, caught relatively early, treatable, but serious. I remember sitting in the oncologist's office with her, because Rain had a work conflict that day, the first of what would become dozens of work conflicts, family conflicts. I just can't handle it emotionally, conflicts over the next 2 decades. That was the beginning of what I now think of as the long stretch. 23 years, on and off, of being the daughter who showed up. Not 23 consecutive years of crisis. There were good stretches, remission periods, years where Mum was healthy and vibrant, and we'd go to the farmer's market together on Saturday mornings, and things almost felt normal. But underneath all of it was the current I always knew I'd have to swim against eventually. My mother's health was fragile, on and off, for over 2 decades, and every time it took a turn, I was the one in the passenger seat of my own car, driving her to appointments, holding the little paper cup of water while she took pills that made her nauseous, sitting in waiting rooms with outdated magazines while machines scanned her body for things we hoped weren't there. The first round of chemo was the worst, because it was new to both of us. I took what vacation days I had and used them up in 6 weeks. After that ran out, I started scheduling client meetings around infusion appointments, working from my phone in hospital parking lots, learning the exact acoustics of a chemo ward, the hum of the IV pumps, the specific squeak of the recliner chairs, the way nurses' shoes sounded different from doctors' shoes on the tile floor. I learned which snacks she could keep down and which ones would come right back up. I learned to recognize the particular grey tint her skin took on about 4 days after treatment. And I'd show up unannounced on those days with soup, because I knew, even when she didn't call, that those were the days she needed someone there. There was a nurse on that ward named Denise, who I came to know almost as well as I knew some of my own co-workers, simply from the sheer number of hours we spent in the same room together. Denise was the one who taught me how to flush a port line properly, how to watch for the early signs of an infection, how to talk my mother through the panic that would sometimes rise up out of nowhere in the middle of an infusion, when the reality of what was happening to her body would suddenly break through whatever calm she'd been holding on to. "You're a natural at this," Denise told me once, handing me a cup of vending machine coffee during a particularly long Tuesday. "Most family members burn out by month 3. You're still here at month 8. I didn't tell her that burning out wasn't really an option I'd been given. I just said thank you and went back to the waiting room. Rain visited during that first round exactly twice. Both times she brought flowers from the gift shop in the hospital lobby, stayed for maybe 40 minutes, took a photo with our mother for Facebook. Mom, bald and smiling gamely for the camera, Rain glowing with makeup and good lighting beside her, and then left before the nurses came in to check vitals because, in her words, "I just can't watch that part. It's too much for me." I stayed for the part where the nurses checked vitals. I stayed for every part. That's not a complaint. Not really. I want to be clear about that. I loved my mother. I wanted to be there. But I also want you to understand the shape of what was happening, because it matters for what comes later. I was building 23 years of evidence, without ever intending to build evidence of anything, simply by being present, appointment after appointment, year after year, while my sister built a scrapbook of 40-minute visits with good lighting. The cancer went into remission after 18 months. We celebrated. Life resumed something like normal. I got married in my early 30s. My husband, Marcus, understood without me ever having to fully explain it. The particular exhaustion of being the reliable one in a family that only noticed reliability when it briefly went missing. I remember our second date, telling him about my family almost as a warning, expecting him to politely excuse himself from ever meeting them. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Sounds like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time. I hope you let someone help you carry it eventually." I married him about 14 months later. We had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, Owen and Mia, and I made a quiet promise to myself in the hospital room after each of their births that I would never let either of them feel the particular loneliness of being the reliable one in their own family. I kept working. I kept driving to my mother's house every Sunday for dinner, partly out of love, and partly, I think now, out of a fear that if I stopped showing up, even for a season, I'd lose whatever fragile claim I had to being considered family at all. The cancer came back when I was 38. Different location this time, more aggressive. This round meant 3 separate hospital stays over the course of a year and a half, including one stretch of 11 days where I slept on a fold-out chair beside her bed because she was terrified of being alone at night. Terrified in a way she'd never admitted to being terrified of anything before. I remember holding her hand at 3 a.m. while a machine beeped somewhere down the hall, and her turning to me, drugged and half-lucid, and saying, "You're the only one who's ever really here, Crystal." And then, because she was my mother, and because old patterns die harder than anything else in this world, the next morning, When Rain finally showed up with coffee and pastries for the nurse's station, my mother's whole face lit up in a way it hadn't lit up for me in 11 days, and she said, "Oh, Rain, sweetheart, you didn't have to come all this way," as if Rain had traveled across an ocean instead of across town, 12 days late. I want to tell you I didn't feel anything in that moment. That would be a lie. I felt exactly what you're probably imagining, but I also learned, over those 23 years, to set that feeling down gently, the way you'd set down something heavy you know you're going to have to pick back up later, and just keep going, because the appointment was in 40 minutes, and somebody had to drive. Owen was 6 that year, Mia was 3, and I remember the particular guilt of dropping them at my neighbor's house at odd hours, of missing Owen's kindergarten holiday concert because my mother had spiked a fever the same afternoon and needed to be taken to urgent care. My neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Pam, never once made me feel like a burden, and to this day I don't think I've ever properly thanked her for the hundreds of hours she quietly absorbed so that I could be 2 places when Rain, once again, could only manage to be in none. By the time I was in my late 40s, I'd spent, by my own rough accounting when I finally sat down and added it up years later, close to $60,000 of my own money on things my mother's insurance didn't cover, supplemental treatments, a used car when hers finally died so she could get to appointments on days I couldn't drive her, a stairlift installed in her house after her hip surgery, groceries during the months her disability checks didn't stretch far enough. I never once asked Rain to split any of it. I told myself it didn't matter, that it wasn't a competition, that I wasn't doing it to be recognized. But there's a difference between not wanting recognition and never getting it, and I think somewhere in my late 40s, something in me, quiet, patient, and tired, started keeping score, even though I never would have admitted that out loud, not even to Marcus. I do remember one conversation with Marcus, though, on the back porch one night after I'd put the kids to bed and driven 40 minutes each way to drop off my mother's medication, because the pharmacy had made an error and she'd been anxious about it all afternoon. I sat down next to him, bone-tired in that specific way that isn't about sleep, and said, "Do you think she even sees it? Any of it?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He just reached over and took my hand, the same hand I'd use, without knowing it yet, to hold my mother's on the day she died. "I think some people," he said finally, "aren't able to see what's right in front of them until they're about to lose it. That doesn't make it fair to you. But I don't think it means she doesn't feel it." I didn't know, at the time, how right he'd turn out to be. My mother's final decline started when I was 50. Vascular dementia, on top of everything else her body had already survived. The last 3 years of her life, she needed help with almost everything. Meals, medication schedules, basic hygiene some days, and always, someone to just sit with her, because the confusion frightened her more than the cancer ever had. I moved her into a small in-law suite we built onto our house, because the alternative, a facility, felt like something I couldn't do to a woman who used to sing me to sleep, however unevenly she'd loved me over the years. Those final 3 years had a rhythm to them that I don't think I'll ever fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Some mornings she knew exactly who I was, would sit at the kitchen table with her coffee and ask about Owen's basketball season or Mia's art classes with total clarity. Other mornings she'd wake up convinced she was 30 years younger, convinced my father was still going to walk through the door any minute, and I'd have to gently, patiently, walk her back into the present, sometimes 4 or 5 times in a single day. There were nights she'd wander into Owen's room by mistake, looking for a version of me that no longer existed. And Owen, bless him, learned to just quietly walk her back to her own bed, without ever once complaining about it, not even as a teenager, when most boys his age would have every excuse to resent the disruption. Rain visited during those final 3 years exactly 6 times. I know the number because I kept a calendar, not out of spite, but because my mother, in her more lucid moments, would ask me, "When is Rain coming?" and I needed to be able to answer her honestly. 6 visits in 3 years. I was there every single day. One of those 6 visits stands out more than the others. It was during a lucid stretch, about a year before the end, and Rain had come by on a Sunday, uncharacteristically, without being asked. I remember watching the two of them from the kitchen doorway, my mother laughing at something Rain had said, reaching out to touch her hair the way she used to when we were small, and feeling a strange, complicated ache, not quite jealousy anymore, something closer to grief, for a version of childhood I'd never gotten to have. After Rain left that day, my mother turned to me, still smiling, and said, "You know, Rain's always been like sunlight, comes and goes as it pleases, but you're grateful when it's there." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I had spent my entire life being the roof that kept the house standing, while everyone admired the sunlight. I just nodded and asked if she wanted tea. My mother died on a Tuesday in early spring, with me holding her hand, the same way I'd held it through every chemo infusion, every hospital stay, every 3 a.m. terror for over 2 decades. Rain arrived 4 hours after she passed, having been on her way for most of the previous day. The funeral was small. My mother had outlived most of her friends, and grief has a way of narrowing a room down to just the people who actually did the work of loving someone, day after unglamorous day. I gave the eulogy. Rain gave a reading, something from a poetry book she'd found online the night before, and cried beautifully through all of it, the way she'd always been able to cry beautifully, while I stood a few feet away with the specific, dry-eyed numbness of someone who'd already done most of her grieving in installments, over 23 years, one hospital hallway at a time. 3 weeks after the funeral, we met with my mother's estate attorney, a calm, silver-haired man named Harold Bennett, who'd handled my mother's affairs for the better part of 15 years. I remember sitting in his office, a modest room with a lot of dark wood and law degrees on the wall, and feeling, I'll be honest, almost nothing. I hadn't cared for my mother for 23 years hoping for an inheritance. I'd done it because she was my mother, and because somebody had to. Rain, on the other hand, arrived 20 minutes early, which she never did for anything, and sat with her legs crossed and her purse in her lap, like a woman waiting for a job offer. Harold read through the will my mother had signed, roughly 8 years earlier, back before the dementia had progressed. In that version, the house, the modest but paid-off house I'd grown up in, the one that had appreciated significantly over the decades, was to be split evenly between Rain and me. The remaining assets, modest savings, some jewelry, a small life insurance policy, were also split down the middle. Rain's face did something complicated when Harold finished reading. Something between relief and vindication, like she'd been worried, somewhere underneath all that confidence, that even this 8-year-old document might not favor her, and was pleasantly surprised to find it did, in the exact 50-50 way she'd apparently been expecting all along. I didn't say anything. I'd made peace, mostly, with the idea that fairness on paper was probably the best I was going to get. And honestly, a part of me was just relieved it was over, relieved that the appointments and the sleepless nights, and the quiet arithmetic of who showed up and who didn't, could finally stop. But Harold wasn't finished. He cleared his throat in a way that made both of us look up, and he said, "There's one more matter I need to address. About 6 months before your mother passed, during one of her more lucid periods, she asked me to come to the house. She wanted to add an addendum to her will, what's called a codicil. She was assessed by her physician the same week to confirm she had testamentary capacity at the time, given her diagnosis, and he confirmed she did. I have that assessment on file, along with the notarized codicil itself. I remember feeling my stomach drop, not because I suspected what was coming, but because in 23 years of appointments and late nights, I'd never once heard my mother mention any of this. She'd kept it from me completely. Harold slid a single document across the desk. Your mother wanted this read aloud, in person, to both of you, rather than simply amended quietly into the file. She was very specific about that. He read it slowly, and I want to give you her words as close to exactly as I remember them, because I've replayed this moment more times than I can count. I, Vivian Ellen Marsh, being of sound mind as confirmed by Dr. Patel on the date below, wish to add the following to my last will and testament. For 23 years, my daughter Crystal has been the one who showed up. She drove me to more appointments than I can count. She held my hand through 3 hospital stays. She built a room onto her own home, so I would not have to die surrounded by strangers. I was not always a fair mother to her when she was young, and I have carried that weight more heavily than I ever told her. I cannot undo those years, but I can make sure that when I am gone, the truth of who took care of me is written down somewhere permanent, in my own words, so that no one can rewrite it later. I am leaving my full share of the house, along with all remaining liquid assets not otherwise designated, to my daughter Crystal. I am leaving my daughter Rain the antique jewelry box that belonged to my own mother, along with my sincere hope that she comes to understand, someday, what her sister gave up so that I would not have to face the last years of my life alone. The room went completely silent. Rain's face had gone through several colors by the time Harold finished. Pale, then red, then a strange tight white around the mouth. "That can't be real," she said. "She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't do that without telling me." "She was very deliberate about it," Harold said gently, "and very clear-headed. I want to say, for the record, that in 15 years of practicing elder law, this is one of the more carefully documented codicils I've seen. Your mother anticipated it might be contested. She wanted to make sure it would hold up." Rain turned to me then, her eyes bright and furious. "Did you know about this? Did you two plan this together?" "No," I said, and I meant it completely. "I found out exactly when you did." She didn't believe me, not that day. She stood up, gathered her purse, and left Harold's office without another word. I sat there for a while after she left, staring at the document, feeling that same complicated grief I'd felt so many times over the years. Not triumph, not vindication, just a tired, aching sadness that my mother had needed a notary and a lawyer to say what most mothers manage to say out loud, over coffee, on an ordinary afternoon. Rain didn't speak to me at all for nearly 4 months after that meeting. I heard, through our cousin Denise, a different Denise than the nurse, though the coincidence always struck me, that Rain had consulted her own attorney about contesting the codicil, and that the attorney had told her, essentially, what Harold had already made clear, a document that carefully witnessed, with a contemporaneous capacity assessment, was going to be extremely difficult to overturn. Rain dropped the matter, at least legally. Emotionally, I don't think she dropped it at all. I think she carried it the way I'd carried so many things over the years, quietly and alone. I want to be clear that I never intended for any of this to become public. I wasn't looking for a stage. In the months after that meeting with Harold, Rain and I existed in a strange, brittle silence. A few clipped texts about logistics, nothing more. I assumed, honestly, that this was simply how the rest of our relationship was going to look. Cordial at holidays my kids attended, otherwise distant. Then Rain got engaged. I found out the way I found out most things about Rain's life by then, through a mutual cousin, not through Rain herself. She was marrying a man named David, someone she'd been dating for about a year, a kind, quiet accountant who, from what I'd heard, had no idea about most of the family history he was marrying into. The wedding was set for early autumn, an outdoor venue about an hour from where I lived, and, somewhat to my surprise, I received an invitation, formal, engraved, addressed to me and Marcus both. I debated for almost 2 weeks about whether to go. Marcus thought I shouldn't put myself through it. My Aunt Deb, still alive and sharp as ever in her 80s, told me I absolutely should, because you've spent your whole life letting that girl write the story, Crystal. Go remind everyone you're in it too. Owen, 19 by then and studying at the State University 2 hours away, called me the week before and said something that stuck with me more than anything Deb or Marcus had offered. Mum, you always taught me not to let fear make my decisions for me. This feels like fear. In the end, I decided to go for one simple reason. I wasn't going to let 23 years of showing up end with me being the one who stayed home. The morning of the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table actually, where my mother used to help Rain glue sequins onto poster boards while I stood in the doorway with a spelling bee flyer nobody had time to look at. And I found myself unexpectedly nervous, the particular nervousness of walking into a room full of people who might, at any moment, ask about my mother, or about the estate, or worse, might already know, through the same slow leak of family gossip that eventually tells everyone everything, and might be watching me all day to see how I'd behave. The wedding itself was lovely. String lights strung between old oak trees, a string quartet, maybe 150 guests. Rain looked genuinely happy, and I want to say, for whatever it's worth, that seeing her happy did something to soften the tight knot I'd been carrying in my chest for months. Whatever our history, she was still my sister, and some stubborn, tired part of me still wanted good things for her. I sat through the ceremony without incident, though I'll admit I cried a little during the vows, not out of any dramatic emotion about Rain specifically, but out of something more general, a sense of time passing, of my mother not being there to see either of her daughters reach whatever this next chapter was going to be. Cocktail hour passed pleasantly enough, Marcus and I making small talk with cousins we hadn't seen in years, most of them careful, I noticed, not to bring up my mother at all, which told me they already knew more than they were letting on. It was during dinner that I first noticed Harold Bennett, seated at a table near the back, with an older couple I didn't recognize. My stomach did a small, uneasy flip, though I told myself immediately that it meant nothing. Harold was a professional, discreet by nature, and there was no reason on earth to think he'd say anything at all, especially not here, at a wedding that had nothing officially to do with him. It turned out he and David's father had been friends for decades, long before any of us knew each other, a coincidence so small and so enormous, it still makes my chest tight to think about. Marcus leaned over at one point during the main course and whispered, "Isn't that the lawyer from the will?" I told him yes, and to please not make a thing of it, and he squeezed my hand under the table and let it go. The toasts began shortly after dinner was cleared. David's best man went first, a warm, funny speech about their college friendship that had the whole tent laughing within the first 30 seconds. Then Rain's maid of honor, a friend from her book club, gave a sweeter, more sentimental toast about how Rain had always been the light in every room she walked into, a phrase that landed differently for me than it likely did for most of the guests, given what my mother had said to me on that porch, not so long before she passed. I clapped along with everyone else. I didn't let my face show anything. As the toasts wound down and the best man handed the microphone back to the DJ, I remember feeling, for just a moment, a small wave of relief. The formal part of the evening was over. The dancing was about to start, and I could relax into the rest of the night without incident. Then, from the back of the tent, Harold Bennett stood up. I want to tell you I saw it coming, but I didn't. Nobody did. I watched him rise from his chair with the same calm, unhurried manner he'd had in his office, straighten his jacket, and gently ask the DJ if he might borrow the microphone for just a moment. The DJ, a young man who clearly had no idea who Harold was or what he might say, simply shrugged and handed it over, assuming, I imagine, that this was some family friend about to offer one more sentimental toast. I've known this family a long time, Harold began, and I felt my stomach tighten in a way I hadn't felt since the day in his office. And I'll keep this brief, because today is about David and Rain, and it should stay that way. I remember glancing at Marcus, whose face had gone very still, and at my son Owen, seated 2 chairs down, who leaned forward slightly, sensing, the way young people sometimes do before the adults around them catch up, that something significant was about to happen. But I was asked, some months ago, by someone very dear to this family, to make sure a particular truth didn't get lost, Harold continued. Vivian Marsh isn't here to see this day, and that's a loss all of you feel. But before she passed, she made something very clear to me, something she wanted honored publicly when the right moment came. She told me, more than once, that her daughter Crystal spent 23 years caring for her, through 2 rounds of cancer, through her final decline, without ever once being asked to, and without ever once being thanked the way she deserved. Vivian wanted that said out loud, in front of family, because she worried that history has a way of getting quietly rewritten by whoever tells the story loudest, and she didn't want that to happen to her daughters. You could have heard a pin drop across that entire reception tent. I remember Marcus's hand finding mine under the table, gripping it tightly. I remember my Aunt Deb, 3 tables away, sitting up very straight with tears already sliding down her face. I remember Owen, quietly, reaching over and putting his hand on my shoulder, the way I'd taught him to comfort his little sister years ago, now doing it for me without a word. And I remember looking across the room at Rain, whose smile had frozen somewhere between confusion and dawning horror, her face draining of color in real time, exactly the way it had in Harold's office months before. She hadn't told her new husband any of it. That much was obvious from David's face, a mixture of confusion and concern, glancing between his new wife and this elderly lawyer standing at his wedding, holding a microphone, delivering what was, unmistakably, a eulogy for a version of Rain that had never quite been true. I watched him lean toward her and whisper something, and I watched Rain shake her head slightly, whether in denial or in an attempt to signal that this wasn't the moment. I couldn't tell. The silence stretched on for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I could feel 150 pairs of eyes beginning to drift toward me, and I remember the specific, dizzying sensation of wanting to disappear, and wanting, at the very same time, for someone, anyone, to have said this out loud years ago, while my mother was still alive to hear it too. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Harold set the microphone down gently, said, "Congratulations, you two, truly," and sat back down, and the DJ, sensing the room needed somewhere to go, mercifully queued up a song and asked everyone to join the couple on the dance floor. Slowly, hesitantly, the tent began to move again. People standing, gathering partners, the ordinary machinery of a wedding reception grinding back into motion, though I noticed more than a few guests glancing my way as they passed, some with sympathy, some with something closer to newfound respect. One older woman I didn't recognize, squeezing my shoulder gently on her way to the dance floor, and saying, simply, "Good for you, honey." Rain found me later, near the edge of the tent, away from the lights. Did you put him up to that? She asked, her voice low and shaking. No, I said, and it was the truth. I didn't even know he was invited. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not quite an apology, not yet, but something closer to it than I'd seen from her in decades. 23 years, she said, quietly, almost to herself. I never counted. I know, I said. I did. We didn't hug. We didn't cry together, not that night. Some wounds don't close just because the truth finally gets spoken out loud at a wedding reception. But something did shift between us, in that quiet moment at the edge of the tent. A small, fragile crack of light, where there had only ever been a locked door before. David found us a few minutes later, quiet and a little pale himself, and said only, I think we have some things to talk about, when the timing's better. Rain nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something like humility settle over her face. It's been almost 2 years since that wedding. Rain and I aren't close, not in the way sisters in movies become close after a dramatic reckoning, but we talk now. She's called me twice, unprompted, just to ask how I'm doing, which doesn't sound like much, until you understand it had never happened once in the 50 years before that. Last spring, she asked if she could come with me to visit our mother's grave, and we stood there together, in silence, for the better part of 20 minutes, and it was the most honest 20 minutes we've spent together in our entire lives. David, I've since learned, sat Rain down about a week after the wedding and asked her, gently, to tell him the whole story, start to finish, no editing. She did. It took most of an evening, she told me later, and she cried through most of it, not performance tears this time, but the kind that come out slowly, from somewhere old. David didn't take sides, not in any dramatic way, but he did tell her, and she repeated this to me almost word for word months later, that he hoped she'd spend the rest of their marriage making sure nobody in their own future family ever had to carry what I'd carried, quietly, for 23 years. I used part of what my mother left me to pay off the addition we'd built onto our house, the little in-law suite where she spent her final years. I kept her jewelry box, the one Rain was left, for exactly as long as it took to have a second one made, identical, so Rain could have one too. I never told her that. Some things you do quietly, not for credit, but because you finally figured out, in your 50s, what your mother spent her whole life trying to teach you, without ever quite finding the words. I think about my mother's letter often, the one Harold read that day in his office. Not the part about the house, or the money, though I won't pretend that didn't matter. I think about the part where she wrote that she hoped Rain would someday understand what I'd given up. I used to think that line was about vindication. My mother finally, publicly, choosing me. Now I think it was about something else entirely. I think it was the closest my mother ever came to apologizing, not just to me, but to both of her daughters, for the uneven way she'd loved us, and for how long it took her to see clearly enough to try to make it right. 23 years is a long time to show up for someone. Longer, honestly, than most people show up for anything in their lives. I didn't do it to be remembered in a will, and I didn't do it to be vindicated at a wedding reception in front of 150 strangers. I did it because she was my mother, and because somewhere along the way, long before any letters or lawyers were involved, I decided that being the reliable one wasn't a punishment. It was simply who I was, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not Rain, not the family's old assumptions, not even my own quiet resentment, take that away from me. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this story, it's this. The people who show up quietly, year after year, without asking for recognition, are often keeping score in ways they don't even realize. And the universe has a strange, patient way of eventually settling those accounts, even if it takes 23 years and a letter your mother never told you she wrote. I still visit her grave every Sunday. I still bring flowers, the same kind she used to grow in her garden before she got sick. And every time I sit there, I find myself thinking the same thing. Some kinds of love take a lifetime to be seen. But eventually, if you're patient, and if you're honest, they are. Would you have shown up the way I did, for 23 years, without knowing how the story would end? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.